Hey guys, welcome back to The Readers. I hope you are having an amazing day. Let's get right into the stories. The first one is an entitled People Story. I never thought I'd be the type of person to go to war with my HOA, but when President Miller tried to extort $250,000 from me, he picked the wrong data analyst to mess with. Let me back up a bit. I've lived in this mid-tier suburban neighborhood for about 12 years now. It's the kind of place where the houses are nice but not mansion level, where people actually wave when they pass each other on evening walks, and where the biggest drama used to be whether the community pool should close at 9 p.m. or 10 p.m. during summer months. I work as a data analyst for an insurance company, which means I spend my days combing through spreadsheets, identifying discrepancies, and building cases based on documentation. My wife always jokes that I'm the most boring person at parties because I actually read the fine print on everything, but that particular skill set was about to become very useful. Our house sits on a corner lot with what I like to call a professional-grade xeriscaped front yard. When we first moved in, I spent months researching drought-resistant plants and creating a landscape design that would look amazing year-round while using minimal water. The result was this gorgeous arrangement of ornamental grasses, succulents, and native shrubs that required virtually no maintenance and looked like something out of a high-end landscaping magazine. President Miller, on the other hand, was the kind of guy who peaked as a middle manager at some corporate office and now treated our HOA like his personal fiefdom. He'd been on the board for 8 years and president for the last 4. Miller was the type who would drive around the neighborhood in his golf cart at 7 a.m. looking for violations. The kind of person who measured grass height with an actual ruler and took photos of trash cans that were left out 30 minutes past the pickup deadline. The first sign of trouble came about 3 months ago when Miller started making comments about my landscaping at HOA meetings. He'd make these passive-aggressive remarks about how certain properties might not maintain the neighborhood's aesthetic standards, always looking directly at me when he said it. Other board members would shift uncomfortably in their seats, but nobody ever called him out directly. Then came the escalation. Miller started showing up at my house unannounced, claiming he was doing property inspections. He'd walk around my front yard taking pictures with this expensive camera, muttering things about municipal codes and architectural integrity. When I asked what specific violations he was documenting, he'd give me these vague responses about how the board was reviewing compliance issues and I'd be notified through proper channels. My wife thought I was being paranoid when I started documenting these visits, writing down dates and times, taking my own photos of Miller on our property. She said I was letting this petty HOA drama get under my skin and that we should just ignore him, but my professional instincts were screaming that something bigger was coming. I was right. Last Tuesday, I came home from work to find a process server waiting in my driveway. The guy handed me a thick manila envelope and asked me to confirm my identity before having me sign for delivery. My wife watched from the front window as I tore open the envelope right there in the driveway, and I'll never forget the moment I saw that number, $250,000. The document was titled Final Notice of Cumulative Noncompliance, and it looked official as hell. Fancy letterhead, multiple pages of legal-sounding language, and that number printed in bold red ink at the bottom like some kind of scarlet letter. According to this notice, I had been in violation of various architectural integrity codes for the past 10 years, accruing daily fines of $68.50, plus compounded interest, plus administrative fees, plus legal consultation costs. My wife nearly fainted when I showed her the paperwork. She kept asking if this was some kind of joke, if someone was pranking us, but the documentation looked completely legitimate. There were case numbers and reference codes and citations to specific HOA bylaws that I'd never even heard of. The notice gave me exactly 14 days to remit payment in full or face immediate lien placement on our property, followed by potential foreclosure proceedings. It also included a helpful note suggesting that residents facing financial hardship might consider negotiating a settlement payment to avoid the full legal consequences of their non-compliance. That night, I spread all the paperwork across our dining room table and started reading every single word. My background in insurance fraud investigation kicked in immediately, and several things struck me as odd right away. First, the daily fine amount seemed arbitrary. Most HOA violations I'd researched typically carried fines between $25 and $50 per day, but this $68.50 figure appeared to be pulled from thin air. Second, the compounded interest calculation was using a rate that seemed suspiciously high for HOA violation penalties. Most jurisdictions cap penalty interest at around 8 to 10% annually, but this was calculating at nearly 15%. Third, and most importantly, the administrative and legal fees section was extremely vague. It referenced consultations with external legal counsel but provided no itemization, no hourly rates, no specific services rendered, just a lump sum of $47,000 labeled as necessary legal expenses incurred during the violation documentation process. I spent the next 3 days researching HOA law in our state and reading through every single page of our community's CC and Rs and bylaws. What I discovered was fascinating. According to our HOA's governing documents, any fine exceeding $500 required approval from a majority of the board of directors, with written documentation of the violation and a formal hearing process where the homeowner could present their defense. Fines exceeding $5,000 required approval from 2/3 of the entire community membership through a special assessment vote. More interesting was the discovery that our HOA was required by state law to maintain a standing fine review committee consisting of at least 3 members who were not part of the board of directors. This committee was supposed to review all violation cases before any penalties could be assessed. I started making phone calls to other residents, casually asking about HOA fines and violation procedures. What I learned was eye-opening. Nobody could remember the last time anyone had been fined more than $100 for anything. Nobody had ever heard of a fine review committee, and most tellingly, several neighbors mentioned that they'd received violation notices in previous years that were later rescinded without explanation. The picture that emerged was of an HOA board that operated with minimal oversight and virtually no documentation of their enforcement procedures. Miller had essentially been making up violation policies as he went along, banking on the fact that most residents would just pay small fines rather than challenge them. But $250,000 was way beyond small fine territory. I decided to attend the next monthly HOA meeting, which happened to fall exactly 1 week after I'd received the violation notice. The meeting was held in the community center, and typically only drew about 15 to 20 residents. That night, I made sure to arrive early and bring a leather portfolio filled with printed documents. Miller sat at the head table with the other 4 board members, looking smugly confident as he called the meeting to order. He ran through the usual agenda items: community pool maintenance, landscaping budget approvals, updates on road repaving projects, all the mundane stuff that normally comprises these meetings. Then he got to new business. Miller cleared his throat and announced that the board had been forced to take action against a property owner who had been in flagrant violation of community standards for an extended period. He didn't mention me by name, but he looked directly at me while explaining how some residents seemed to think they could ignore HOA regulations without consequences. That's when I stood up. The room went completely silent as I opened my portfolio and pulled out a thick stack of papers. I've given presentations to insurance executives and testified in fraud cases, so I knew how to project calm authority even when my heart was pounding. I said that I'd received the violation notice and wanted to clarify a few procedural questions before proceeding with any payment or legal response. Since this was a substantial financial claim, I explained, my insurance company and legal team would need to review all supporting documentation before determining coverage. Miller's confident expression started to shift as I continued talking. I mentioned that my legal team was particularly interested in reviewing the line-item breakdown of the daily violation assessments, the photographic evidence supporting each infraction claim, and the documentation showing proper notification procedures had been followed for each violation. I also noted that my insurance adjuster would need to verify that all fines had been assessed by a properly constituted fine review committee, as required by state law, and that any legal fees included in the assessment were for legitimate HOA business and not personal legal matters. Miller interrupted me to say that all the documentation was obviously in the HOA's archives and that I should just work with him directly to resolve this matter quickly and quietly. He suggested that these kinds of large violation assessments could often be settled for a much smaller amount, maybe $50,000, if I was willing to work with the board cooperatively. That's when I knew for certain this was a scam. I pulled out another document from my portfolio and explained that I'd prepared a formal request for production of documents that would be served to each board member within 24 hours. This request demanded copies of every single photograph, inspection report, violation notice, and fee calculation that supported the $250,000 assessment. The request also demanded documentation showing when and how the fine review committee had reviewed my case, copies of all legal invoices and retainer agreements related to my property, and verification that proper notification procedures had been followed for each alleged violation. I explained that state law required HOA boards to produce all requested documents within 30 days, and that failure to provide complete documentation could void any violation assessment. Miller's face was turning red as I spoke. and the other board members were exchanging worried glances. One of them, an older woman who'd been on the board for 2 years, asked Miller quietly if he had all this documentation ready to provide. Miller waved her off and said everything was properly documented and that I was just trying to delay the inevitable. He suggested that the board should proceed with lien placement immediately rather than entertaining frivolous document requests. That's when I dropped the bombshell. I pulled out a folder containing copies of documents I'd obtained from the county recorder's office. Inside were the original architectural approval forms for my landscaping project, submitted and approved 8 years ago, with Miller's signature clearly visible on the approval stamp. I explained that according to county records, President Miller had personally reviewed and approved my xeriscaped front yard design in writing, including specific plant selections and layout arrangements. The approval was still valid and had never been rescinded through any official HOA process. The room erupted in whispers as Miller stammered that he didn't remember signing any such approval and that the documents must be outdated or superseded by newer regulations. I smiled and mentioned that my legal team would be very interested in exploring whether selective enforcement of retroactively applied regulations might constitute harassment, discrimination, or fraud, especially when combined with apparent financial irregularities in the assessment calculation. Miller abruptly adjourned the meeting, claiming that the discussion had moved beyond the scope of general community business and should be handled through proper legal channels. As residents filed out of the community center, several approached me privately. They mentioned that they'd received violation notices from Miller over the years that seemed questionable, and a few admitted they'd paid small fines just to avoid confrontation. One neighbor said his wife had always suspected something fishy about Miller's enforcement patterns, but they'd never wanted to rock the boat. The next morning, I followed through on my promise and had a process server deliver document requests to each board member's home address. The legal papers were properly formatted and cited specific state statutes requiring HOA transparency in violation proceedings. 3 days later, I received a phone call from Miller. His tone was completely different now, less aggressive and more conciliatory. He suggested that perhaps there had been some miscommunication about my violation assessment and that the board might be willing to review the case if I was interested in resolving things amicably. I told him I was absolutely interested in resolving things, preferably through a complete line-by-line review of every charge included in the assessment. I suggested we schedule an emergency board meeting where I could present my analysis of the documentation once he provided it. Miller agreed, though he sounded reluctant. He said the board would gather all relevant materials and we could meet the following week to discuss everything in detail. That weekend, I dedicated my entire Saturday to research. I drove to the county courthouse and spent hours going through public records related to our HOA. What I discovered was even more damaging than I'd expected. For 4 consecutive years, from 2018 through 2021, our HOA had operated without a properly constituted fine review committee. The board had simply stopped appointing committee members after several residents moved away, and nobody had bothered to fill the vacant positions. This meant that every single fine assessed during that period was legally invalid under state law. Any violation included in my assessment from those years was automatically void. I also discovered that Miller had amended several HOA bylaws without proper community notification or voting procedures. The architectural standards he was trying to enforce against me had never actually been ratified by the community membership, making them essentially worthless from a legal standpoint. Most damaging of all, I found records showing that the law firm billing our HOA for legal consultation work was owned by Miller's brother-in-law. Cross-referencing the dates of legal invoices with HOA meeting minutes revealed that most of these consultations involved Miller's personal property disputes and business matters, not legitimate HOA legal work. Monday morning, I called Miller and told him I was ready for our emergency meeting. I suggested we invite all board members and any community residents who wanted to attend, since transparency in HOA governance benefits everyone. Miller tried to insist on a private meeting, just him and me, but I explained that my legal team had advised me to ensure all discussions were witnessed and documented. I offered to bring a court reporter to create an official transcript if that would be helpful. The emergency meeting was scheduled for Thursday evening, and I spent the week preparing what I privately called my presentation materials. I created a massive 3-ring binder containing every document, every regulation, every legal citation, and every piece of evidence I'd gathered. Thursday arrived, and the community center was packed. Word had spread through the neighborhood that something big was happening, and residents who normally never attended HOA meetings showed up in force. Miller looked visibly uncomfortable as he called the meeting to order. I requested permission to address the board regarding my violation assessment, and Miller reluctantly agreed. I approached the front table with my binder and a portable easel where I'd mounted a large poster showing the breakdown of my alleged $250,000 fine. Then I began systematically dismantling his case, line by line. I started with violations 1 through 500, which allegedly occurred between 2018 and 2019. I presented documentation showing that during this period, Miller had taken a 3-month vacation to visit his daughter in another state, and that no official HOA property inspections had been conducted during his absence. More importantly, I showed that these violations had been assessed without review by a fine review committee, which didn't exist at the time, making every single fine legally invalid under state law. Violations 501 through 1000, covering 2020 through 2021, were based on architectural standards that had never been properly adopted by the community. I presented copies of HOA meeting minutes showing that the bylaws Miller was citing had been discussed but never actually voted on by the membership. The legal fees portion of my assessment was perhaps the most interesting section. I had documentation showing that $47,000 in alleged legal consultation costs were actually bills for Miller's personal legal matters, including his divorce proceedings and a business partnership dispute that had nothing to do with HOA governance. As I presented each section of evidence, I could see Miller getting more and more agitated. He kept interrupting to claim that I was misunderstanding the documentation or taking things out of context, but every time he spoke, I calmly referred to specific legal citations and state statutes that supported my position. The other board members were looking increasingly uncomfortable as the presentation continued. The treasurer, a retired accountant, started asking Miller pointed questions about why he'd never been shown the supporting documentation for such a large assessment. By the time I finished my presentation, nearly 2 hours later, it was clear that Miller's case had completely fallen apart. Not only were the vast majority of the alleged violations legally invalid, but the assessment process itself had violated multiple state laws governing HOA operations. The board members huddled for a whispered conversation while I packed up my materials. When they returned, the treasurer announced that the board was withdrawing the violation assessment pending a complete review of HOA enforcement procedures. Miller looked furious, but he was outvoted by the other board members who clearly wanted to distance themselves from what was obviously becoming a legal liability. After the meeting, several residents approached me to thank me for standing up to Miller's bullying tactics. One elderly gentleman mentioned that Miller had tried to fine him 2 years ago for parking his RV in his own driveway, even though the HOA bylaws contain no such restriction. A week later, I received a formal letter from the HOA's new legal counsel, not Miller's brother-in-law, officially rescinding my violation assessment and issuing a written apology for the error in documentation and procedure. The letter also informed me that President Miller had submitted his resignation from the board effective immediately, citing personal reasons and a desire to pursue other interests. 2 weeks after that, the board voted to implement new oversight procedures for violation assessments, including mandatory fine review committee approval for any fine exceeding $100 and quarterly audits of all HOA financial transactions. They also voted to reimburse me for the time I'd spent researching and documenting their procedural failures. The check wasn't huge, about $1,500, but it came directly from Miller's forfeited board security deposit, which made it particularly satisfying. The best part came a month later when I was walking my dog past Miller's house. I noticed he was outside taking down the little metal plaque that had hung next to his front door identifying him as HOA president. He saw me watching and quickly ducked back inside without making eye contact. The neighborhood has been remarkably peaceful since then. The new HOA president is a retired teacher who believes in consensus building and transparent communication. Violation notices are rare and minor, usually just friendly reminders about trash can schedules or holiday decoration deadlines. My xeriscaped front yard continues to be the envy of water-conscious neighbors, and I've never received another violation notice. Several residents have actually asked me for landscaping advice, saying they want to create something similar for their own properties. Looking back, I realize this whole situation taught me something important about standing up to bullies and the power of documentation. Miller was counting on me being intimidated by official-looking paperwork and scary dollar amounts. He assumed I'd either pay a settlement to make the problem go away or be too overwhelmed to challenge his authority effectively. What he didn't count on was dealing with someone who makes a living analyzing fraudulent claims and identifying discrepancies in complex financial documents. Every day at work, I investigate people who think they can create fake evidence and manipulate systems for personal gain. Miller's HOA scam was actually pretty amateur compared to some of the insurance fraud cases I've worked on. The experience also reinforced my belief that most bullies are fundamentally cowards who fold when confronted with organized resistance. Miller had been getting away with his petty tyranny for years because previous targets had chosen to avoid confrontation rather than fight back systematically. But when faced with someone who was willing to do the research, gather the evidence, and present a methodical challenge to his authority, his whole power structure collapsed within a matter of weeks. These days, when I see Miller around the neighborhood, he's noticeably subdued. He waves politely when we pass each other, but gone is the swagger and self-importance that used to characterize his interactions with residents. I sometimes wonder how many other homeowners in other neighborhoods are dealing with similar HOA abuse, paying questionable fines and assessments simply because they don't know how to challenge the system effectively. The truth is, HOA boards derive their power from community members who grant them authority through participation and compliance. When residents understand their rights and are willing to hold board members accountable, even the most egotistical wannabe dictators have to follow the rules like everyone else. My advice to anyone facing similar HOA harassment is simple. Documentation beats intimidation every time. Know your community's governing documents, understand your state's HOA laws, and never be afraid to demand transparency in board operations. And if someone tries to hit you with a $250,000 fine for having a nice garden, make them prove every single penny of it. The silence in our neighborhood these days isn't the oppressive quiet of people afraid to challenge authority. It's the peaceful silence of a community where residents can focus on enjoying their homes instead of worrying about arbitrary enforcement and manufactured violations. That kind of peace is worth fighting for, one line item at a time. The aftermath of Miller's resignation had ripple effects throughout our community that I hadn't anticipated. Within 6 months, 2 other longtime board members stepped down, saying they wanted to make room for fresh perspectives and new ideas. The woman who'd served as treasurer for nearly a decade admitted she'd been uncomfortable with some of Miller's enforcement tactics but hadn't known how to challenge them effectively. What emerged was a completely different style of HOA governance. The new board established monthly office hours where residents could ask questions about regulations or request clarification on community policies. They created a suggestion box system where neighbors could anonymously report concerns or propose improvements without fear of retaliation. Most importantly, they instituted a policy requiring all violation assessments to be reviewed by an independent committee before any fines could be imposed. This committee consisted of 3 residents who rotated annually and had no connection to the board of directors. About 8 months after the whole ordeal ended, I received an unexpected visit from a reporter covering a story about HOA abuse in suburban communities. Apparently, my case had become something of a legend in local legal circles, and several attorneys had started using my documentation methods as examples of how residents could protect themselves from board overreach. The reporter asked if I'd be willing to share my experience as part of a broader investigation into questionable HOA practices. I agreed, though I insisted on keeping all personal details anonymous to protect my family's privacy. The article that resulted was published in the regional newspaper and picked up by several online platforms. While it didn't mention my name or specific neighborhood, it detailed the tactics I'd used to challenge Miller's fraudulent assessment and provided resources for other homeowners facing similar situations. Within weeks of the article's publication, I started receiving emails from people across the state asking for advice about their own HOA disputes. Most were dealing with much smaller issues, fines in the hundreds rather than hundreds of thousands of dollars, but the underlying patterns were remarkably similar. Arbitrary enforcement of vague regulations, retaliation against residents who questioned board decisions, assessment of fees without proper documentation or oversight. The more stories I heard, the more I realized that Miller's behavior wasn't unique, just more extreme than usual. I started spending my weekends helping neighbors research their HOA governing documents and understand their legal rights. My wife joked that I'd accidentally become the neighborhood's unofficial HOA consultant, but she supported my efforts because she'd seen how empowering it could be for people to understand they had recourse against abusive authority. One case that particularly stood out involved an elderly couple in their 80s who'd been fined repeatedly for having brown spots in their lawn during a drought year. The fines had accumulated to nearly $3,000, and the board was threatening to place a lien on their home if they didn't pay immediately. When I reviewed their situation, I discovered that their HOA's landscaping requirements actually included specific provisions for drought conditions that exempted residents from maintaining green lawns during water restrictions. The board had been ignoring their own bylaws while assessing penalties. A single letter citing the relevant bylaw sections and threatening to file a complaint with the state regulatory agency resolved the matter within a week. The couple's fines were rescinded and they received a written apology from the board. Stories like these reinforce my belief that most HOA disputes stem from board members who either don't understand their own community's governing documents or choose to ignore them when it's convenient. The solution isn't necessarily confrontation, it's education and accountability. My experience with Miller also taught me something about the psychology of petty authoritarianism. People like him thrive in systems with minimal oversight where they can make arbitrary decisions without having to justify their reasoning. They count on other people being too busy, too intimidated, or too uninformed to challenge their authority effectively. But when confronted with systematic resistance backed by proper documentation and legal knowledge, their power evaporates quickly. Miller's entire reign of terror collapsed within a matter of weeks once someone was willing to do the homework necessary to expose his illegal practices. The irony wasn't lost on me that my professional skills in fraud investigation had proven so relevant to dealing with HOA abuse. Both situations involve people who think they can manipulate systems and create false documentation to support illegitimate claims. Both require methodical research and careful documentation to expose the truth. The difference is that insurance fraud is clearly criminal behavior that gets prosecuted by district attorneys, while HOA abuse often falls into a legal gray area where residents have to advocate for themselves through civil procedures. This distinction highlights why so many homeowners simply pay questionable fines rather than fighting them. The time and effort required to research governing documents, understand state regulations, and prepare formal challenges can be overwhelming for people who just want to live peacefully in their homes. That's exactly what bullies like Miller count on, the assumption that most people will choose to avoid confrontation rather than invest the energy necessary to hold them accountable for their actions. But what I learned is that the investment is almost always worth it, not just for the immediate resolution, but for the long-term impact on community dynamics. When residents understand their rights and are willing to exercise them, it creates a culture of transparency and accountability that benefits everyone. Our neighborhood is proof of that transformation. The new board publishes detailed financial reports quarterly, holds open forums for resident input, and maintains a community website where all governing documents and meeting minutes are easily accessible. Violation notices are rare and always include specific documentation of the infraction and clear instructions for appeal procedures. The contrast with Miller's secretive, authoritarian approach couldn't be more stark. Where once residents whispered complaints about arbitrary enforcement and unfair treatment, now people actually volunteer to serve on committees and participate in community planning. My xeriscaped garden, which started this whole mess, has become something of a neighborhood showcase. The new board featured it in a community newsletter article about water-wise landscaping, and several residents have implemented similar designs for their own properties. The transformation feels like a small victory for democracy and transparency, proof that ordinary residents can successfully challenge abuse of authority when they're willing to do the work necessary to build a strong case. I still keep all my documentation from the Miller situation in a file cabinet in my home office. Not because I expect to need it again, but as a reminder that standing up to bullies requires preparation, patience, and persistence. Every time I pass Miller's former house, now occupied by a young family who wave cheerfully from their front yard, I'm reminded that communities are shaped by the people who live in them. When residents choose engagement over apathy, accountability over compliance, and transparency over secrecy, even the most entrenched problems can be solved. The $250,000 fine that started this whole adventure turned out to be Miller's biggest mistake. If he'd tried to extract a few $100s, I might have paid it just to avoid the hassle. But by getting greedy and overreaching so dramatically, he forced me to dig deep enough to uncover the systematic problems with his entire approach to HOA governance. Sometimes the best thing that can happen to a bully is for them to finally pick on someone who's willing and able to fight back effectively. It's a lesson that benefits not just the immediate target, but everyone else who might have been victimized if the pattern had continued unchecked. These days, when people ask me about dealing with difficult HOA situations, I always emphasize the same key points. Document everything, research your governing documents, understand your legal rights, and don't be intimidated by official-looking paperwork or threats of legal action. Most importantly, remember that HOA boards derive their authority from community members, not the other way around. When residents understand this fundamental relationship and are willing to hold their boards accountable, even the most problematic situations can be resolved through proper channels. The silence in our neighborhood now isn't the fearful quiet of people afraid to challenge authority. It's the peaceful silence of a community where residents can focus on enjoying their homes, confident that their HOA board operates with transparency, fairness, and respect for everyone's rights. That's the kind of neighborhood worth living in, and it's the kind of outcome worth fighting for when bullies try to destroy it for their own petty satisfaction. The next one is a malicious compliance story. Okay, so a little backstory first. I am a 20 years old college student full-time and doing 23 plus hours a week on top of classes to make ends meet. I live paycheck to paycheck and have a car was paying off. I used to work at a McDonald's in my hometown, but since I moved to live on campus, which was 45 minutes away from my old job, and I wasn't willing to make the commute, so I decided to apply, and got accepted, to a small sandwich shop 10 minutes from my college, which was a blessing. It started out great, plenty of hours, easy work, fast days, till the old manger decided to switch stores. The new manager was one of the biggest Karens you have ever met. Like bad, and when I say bad, I really mean it. She completely changed the procedures and made things so much worse. And when I'd have to stay over sometimes too, 3 hours after closing, she'd burst in the next day yelling, screaming at the top of her lungs, "Stop staying later, you have to be out by 8:30, we won't pay you for any time past then." I had no choice because the list she gave me to close the store alone every night, may I add, was extremely time-consuming, especially with no help. I was expected to stop serving at 8 and do 5 people's worth of work in 30 minutes. It simply wasn't doable. Hearing I wasn't going to be paid for time, I worked time. I spent making sure everything was done on the list before I left. Otherwise, I'd be fired for not doing all of it would go unpaid. As well as I'd be fired if I stayed longer than 8:30. There was no winning. On top of that, the moment management switched, they decided they were giving people to many hours, and cut me to only 3 hours a week. That went on for 4 weeks, till I decided enough was enough. $45 work weeks wasn't even worth putting in the time and effort to even show up. So, on one of my weekends, I was with my parents off campus. I was due to work that day. 3 hours, of course, my only day that week. I was shopping near said sandwich shop. It's located inside a Walmart. My mom and I were discussing for the last week how should just quiet, since it seems they are trying to fire me without saying they are firing me, wanting me to leave on my own so they wouldn't need to fill out paperwork. Right then and there I decided, know what, duck this job and duck my entitled Karen boss. I sent her a text that I quiet on the spot and to not expect me to come in that night for my shift. She texts me back ranting about how, since I'm not giving her a 2-week notice, I'll never be able to work at one of those sandwich shops again. At that point, I didn't care. I already had to give up my brand new car of only 4 months because I couldn't pay my loan and insurance. It was a nice car to a white, shimmery 2016 Hyundai Sonata. I loved that thing. I told her at some point that week I'd try to get the brand new uniform that, funny enough, they had just gave to me the week prior, a whole 3.5 months after I started working there. But I warned her my classes run till right before closing. I didn't know when I'd be able to do so. She texted back in what I could only imagine the snarkiest tone possible. "No, I need that uniform back tomorrow." I told her I'm sorry, but that may not be possible due to my school schedule, and I'm not willing to ditch a class to drop off a few pieces of clothing. She said, "No, you will bring it back tomorrow. Don't even try to lie to me. You were seen in store the day you quit. No excuses." Okay, then she said no excuses. I didn't want to go into an argument with her over it, and knowing she herself would be closing that day and my classes ended at 8 exactly, I happily complied. I made sure ID arrived right as she was closing the lock on the gate. I was bringing the clothes in my reusable shopping bag. I had no throwaway bags, and since she can't take and claim my bag as her own, I was just going to give her the clothes one piece at a time. Knowing she would have to carry them out of the store, juggling them back home made me happy. When it came time to deliver my uniform to her, all the stars seemed to align perfectly. I arrived at 8:30, caught her on the way out with the outfit not even in a reusable bag to begin with. As an extra touch of sweet, unplanned irony, it was raining outside. Hard rain, the sidewalks I guess were extra slippery and muddy, cause on my way in, I slipped and landed chest first into the mud. I was mostly spared though, because the clothes were there to break my fall and absorb most of the filth. Dropping off the muddy, loose clothes, seeing her reaction, watching her stomp her feet, wrench in disgust, holding the clothes 10 feet away from her body, huff and puff marching out of the store in pure shock and disbelief. She didn't even have words for me. It was the sweetest revenge I had ever seen. This did mean I had to buy a whole new set of clothes and change in the Walmart bathroom, but it was all worth it to see her reaction in the end. After I had returned to my dorm that evening, I sent her a text saying simply, "Enjoy," and I blocked her number. Safe to say karma really did pay out on my end. Anyway, thank you for watching.